My name is Elena Rodriguez, and the day CIA Director Harrison called my personal line asking for an urgent briefing, my father was in the garage telling my nephew that his Aunt Elena still lived in Fantasyland, playing pretend spy games like she did when she was 12. I answered that call on speaker, watching Dad's wrench freeze mid-turn as Director Harrison's voice filled the oil-stained air. Rodriguez, we need your analysis on the Beijing situation. Can you be in Langley by 1800? For the first time in 34 years, my father had nothing to say. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Tucson, Arizona, I was that kid who memorized license plates for fun and could tell you which neighbor was lying about their weekend plans just by watching them load their car. While other 8-year-olds played house or collected dolls, I set up elaborate surveillance operations in our backyard, complete with coded messages and fake identities for my stuffed animals. My bedroom walls were covered with world maps marked with red pins, each one representing what I called my mission locations. Mom would find me at my desk at midnight, flashlight in hand, reading library books about cryptography and international relations. Dad thought it was ridiculous. Miguel Rodriguez had spent 26 years installing air conditioning units across southern Arizona, building his reputation one sweltering summer at a time. He understood practical things, tangible things, fixing compressors, replacing ductwork, collecting checks from grateful customers who could finally sleep through August nights. When he came home after 14-hour days, boots caked with desert dust and shirt soaked through with honest sweat, the last thing he wanted to see was his daughter hunched over what he called her spy nonsense. Elena is living in her own little world, he'd tell Mom over dinner, gesturing at my latest creation, which might be a detailed floor plan of our neighbor's house or a chart tracking the mailman's route variations. She needs to come back to reality. Girls her age should be thinking about normal things, not playing secret agent. He'd shake his head and reach for another tortilla, muttering about how television was filling kids' heads with impossible dreams. But I wasn't watching television. I was reading everything I could get my hands on about intelligence gathering, international affairs, and conflict resolution. The public library became my second home, and Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, started setting aside books she thought I'd enjoy. Another spy thriller for our young analyst, she'd say with a wink, though most of what she saved for me wasn't fiction. I devoured biographies of intelligence officers, histories of Cold War operations, and academic papers on geopolitical strategy that I probably understood about half of, but absorbed anyway.
Mom tried to bridge the gap between Dad's practicality and my obsession. Carmen Rodriguez had been a high school English teacher before I was born, and she understood the power of imagination, even if she worried about where mine might lead me. "Let her explore, Miguel," she'd say when Dad complained about finding me in the closet with a headlamp, transcribing what I claimed were coded radio transmissions. "Maybe she'll become a detective or work for the government someday." Dad would snort and return to his newspaper, making it clear he thought those were just as unlikely as my becoming an actual spy. The summer I turned 10, everything escalated. I had developed what I called the Neighborhood Intelligence Network, a system for monitoring and documenting everything that happened within a 6-block radius of our house. I knew that Mrs. Chen received mysterious packages every Tuesday that she immediately hid in her garage, that the Martinez family was planning to move because they'd started throwing away items they'd normally keep, and that our mailman Tony was dating someone new because he'd started wearing cologne and checking his reflection in car windows. I presented my findings to my parents one evening after dinner, complete with a hand-drawn organizational chart and a timeline of significant events. Dad listened for about 30 seconds before standing up from the table, his face red with frustration. "Elena, this is enough. You're spying on our neighbors like some kind of junior detective. It's weird and it needs to stop." He pointed at my carefully prepared presentation materials. Real life doesn't work like your spy books. Real jobs require real skills, not make-believe adventures. But I am learning real skills, I protested, spreading out my documents. Look at this pattern analysis and these observational techniques. I'm documenting everything systematically, and I've already identified 3 significant anomalies that could indicate— Anomalies? Dad's voice rose. Elena, these are people living their lives, not characters in your imaginary missions.
Chen probably orders groceries online. The Martinez family might be renovating. And Tony can wear cologne if he wants to, without it being part of some conspiracy. He gathered up my papers and handed them back to me. I'm serious about this. Find a normal hobby. Join the softball team. Learn to cook, something that will actually help you in the real world. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd arranged on my ceiling in the pattern of constellations visible from various world capitals. Dad's words echoed in my mind, but instead of discouraging me, they solidified my resolve. If he thought my work was make-believe, I'd have to prove him wrong by making it real. I started researching how people actually became intelligence officers, what kind of education they needed, and what skills would make me valuable to organizations that did this kind of work professionally. By middle school, I had shifted my focus from backyard surveillance to academic preparation. I threw myself into languages, starting with Spanish, which I already spoke at home, then adding French and Mandarin through online programs and community college classes. I joined the debate team, the Model United Nations Club, and convinced my social studies teacher to let me write extra credit reports on international conflicts and diplomatic negotiations. My grades were exceptional, but Dad remained unimpressed. She's book smart, he did mite to relatives who asked about my academic achievements, but she still has her head in the clouds with all this international stuff. She needs to focus on something practical, something she can actually do here in Arizona. When I won the state championship in Model UN, representing Pakistan in a simulation of Middle East peace negotiations, Dad's response was to ask if they had given out prizes for anything useful, like mathematics or business. The disconnect between us grew wider as I got older. During high school, I started attending lectures at the University of Arizona, sitting in the back of political science and international relations classes whenever professors would allow it. I built relationships with graduate students who would let me read their research papers and discuss current events from perspectives I'd never considered. My understanding of global affairs deepened, but at home, Dad continued to see it as elaborate pretending. Senior year, when college acceptance letters started arriving, the tension reached a breaking point. I'd been accepted to Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, my dream school, with a partial scholarship that would make it financially possible. I presented the acceptance letter to my parents over breakfast, barely able to contain my excitement about finally being able to study international affairs at the highest level, surrounded by people who shared my passion for understanding global complexity. Dad read the letter twice, his expression growing more troubled with each word. Finally, he set it down and looked at me with a mixture of disappointment and concern. Elena, this is exactly what I've been worried about. You're going to spend 4 years and a fortune studying things that don't lead to real jobs. Foreign service, international relations, these are fancy names for unemployment. What happens when you graduate and realize companies need accountants and engineers, not people who can discuss politics in different countries? I tried to explain the career paths that opened up with my chosen major, the government agencies and private organizations that desperately needed people with international expertise, but Dad wasn't listening. In his mind, I was still the little girl playing spy games, only now I was about to waste my college years on an expensive version of the same fantasy. Your cousin Rebecca is studying nursing. That's a real job that helps real people. Maybe you should consider something like that instead. Mom intervened before the conversation could become a full argument, but the damage was done. Even my greatest academic achievement was being dismissed as further evidence of my disconnect from reality. That night, I called Georgetown to accept their offer. And I knew I was doing it not just because I wanted to study international affairs, but because I needed to prove that my imaginary missions could become something tangible and valuable in the real world. College was everything I had hoped it would be and more.
Georgetown's School of Foreign Service surrounded me with professors who had actually worked in embassies, intelligence agencies, and international organizations. My classmates came from around the world, bringing perspectives and experiences that challenged everything I thought I knew about global affairs. For the first time in my life, my passion for international relations wasn't seen as weird or impractical. It was the foundation for serious academic and professional development. I excelled in my coursework, particularly in classes focusing on intelligence analysis and national security policy. Professor Martinez, who had spent 15 years with the State Department before transitioning to academia, became a mentor who helped me understand how my natural analytical abilities could be developed into professional expertise. She told me, "You have an intuitive grasp of pattern recognition," after I'd presented an analysis of emerging terrorist networks that had impressed visiting government officials. "That's not something we can teach, it's something we can only help you refine." During my sophomore year, I applied for and was accepted into a summer internship program with the National Security Agency.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The application process was extensive, involving multiple interviews, a thorough background check, and psychological evaluations that tested my ability to handle classified information and work under pressure. When I called home to share the news, Dad's reaction was predictably lukewarm. "That sounds very official," he said, "but what will you actually be doing? Filing papers?" I explained that I'd be working on signals intelligence analysis, contributing to actual national security operations, but I could hear him losing interest as the conversation became more technical. The NSA internship changed everything. For 10 weeks, I worked alongside career intelligence professionals, contributing to real-world analysis that informed policy decisions and operational planning. My supervisors were impressed with my ability to identify patterns in complex datasets and my knack for synthesizing information from multiple sources into actionable intelligence products. At the end of the program, my supervisor pulled me aside for what I assumed would be a routine exit interview. "Elena, we'd like you to consider coming back after graduation," she said, sliding a business card across the conference table. "Not as an intern, but as a full-time intelligence analyst. Your work this summer has been exceptional, and we think you have significant potential for advancement within the intelligence community." The business card was simple, white with black lettering, but it represented everything I'd been working towards since I was 10 years old, documenting neighborhood activities in my backyard fort. I called home that evening, barely able to contain my excitement about being offered a real job in intelligence analysis before I'd even started my junior year. Dad listened to my explanation of the offer and the career path it represented, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the phone. Finally, he spoke, his voice tired and skeptical. "Elena, this all sounds very impressive, but are you sure they're offering you a real job? Government work is complicated, and sometimes these things don't work out the way they promise. Maybe you should have a backup plan, something more reliable." Even with a concrete job offer from a major intelligence agency, Dad still saw my career aspirations as elaborate fantasy. I realized then that no amount of academic success or professional validation would change his mind until he could see tangible results, the kind of proof that couldn't be dismissed or explained away as temporary good luck or bureaucratic mistake. My junior and senior years flew by in a blur of advanced coursework, additional internships, and networking events that connected me with alumni working throughout the intelligence community. I specialized in East Asian affairs, becoming fluent in Mandarin, and developing expertise in Chinese political and economic systems. My senior thesis analyzed emerging cyber warfare capabilities among state actors, and it was good enough to be classified and briefed to senior officials in multiple agencies. But at home, Dad continued to refer to my studies as Elena's international phase, as if it were something I'd eventually outgrow, like a teenage obsession with pop music. Graduation day was bittersweet. Mom was proud and excited, taking dozens of photos and beaming as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Dad attended, wearing his best suit and polishing his shoes for the occasion, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes as he watched me celebrate with classmates who were heading to positions with the State Department, CIA, and various military intelligence agencies. During the reception, when other parents asked about my post-graduation plans, Dad would mumble something about government work and quickly change the subject, clearly uncomfortable discussing career paths he didn't fully understand or believed in. 2 weeks after graduation, I started my position as an intelligence analyst with the Central Intelligence Agency, working out of their headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The security clearance process had taken months, involving interviews with neighbors, former teachers, and college friends, but I'd finally been granted access to the classified materials and systems that would allow me to contribute to actual intelligence operations. My first assignment was to a team focusing on Chinese military modernization, exactly the kind of work I'd been preparing for throughout college. The job was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more challenging than I had imagined. I spent my days analyzing satellite imagery, communications intercepts, and human intelligence reports, looking for patterns that might indicate changes in Chinese military capabilities or intentions. My colleagues were brilliant, dedicated professionals who took the responsibility to national security seriously, and I was thrilled to finally be part of that community. But when I called home to share details about my work that weren't classified, Dad's responses remained politely skeptical. "That sounds very important, Elena," he'd say, when I described a successful analysis I'd completed or recognition I'd received from supervisors. "I'm glad you're enjoying it. How long do you think you'll stay with this job?" The question always stung because it revealed his assumption that my career in intelligence was temporary, something I'd eventually abandoned for more conventional work. He never asked about the substance of my assignments or showed curiosity about the geopolitical issues I was grappling. Instead, he treated my job like an extended internship that would eventually lead to something more practical and familiar. My first major breakthrough came during my second year at the agency. I'd been tracking unusual patterns in Chinese military communications that suggested preparation for a significant operation, but I couldn't determine the target or timeline. Working 16-hour days for 3 weeks, I finally identified the correlation between communication patterns and satellite imagery that revealed China was planning a major military exercise designed to test their ability to blockade Taiwan. My analysis allowed policymakers to prepare diplomatic responses and military contingencies that ultimately deterred Chinese aggression and preserved stability in the Taiwan Strait. The director of Central Intelligence personally commended my work, and my analysis was briefed to the President and National Security Council. It was the kind of career-defining achievement that most intelligence analysts work years to accomplish. But when I called home to share the news in general terms, Dad's reaction was characteristically underwhelming. "Congratulations, honey. I'm sure your bosses are happy with your work. Are you still living in that small apartment, or have you been able to find something bigger?" He seemed more concerned about my housing situation than about the fact that I'd contributed to preventing a potential international crisis. By my 5th year at the agency, I'd established myself as one of the leading experts on Chinese military and intelligence capabilities. I'd been promoted twice, earned commendations from multiple senior officials, and my analyses were regularly requested by policymakers of the highest levels of government. I was frequently invited to brief congressional committees, participate in interagency working groups, and consult on major strategic decisions affecting U.S.-China relations. My work was making a real difference in protecting American national security interests, but at home, Dad still introduced me as my daughter Elena, who works for the government in Washington. The phrase "works for the government" became his standard explanation for my career, as if I were processing tax returns or managing a national park rather than conducting intelligence analysis that informed some of the most important foreign policy decisions of our time. When relatives or neighbors ask for details, he shrug and say, "She does something with computers and international news, very complicated stuff that I don't really understand." The dismissive tone never changed, even as my responsibilities and recognition within the intelligence community continued to grow. My breaking point came during a family gathering for my cousin Rebecca's wedding. Rebecca had become a nurse, exactly the kind of practical career Dad had always encouraged me to consider, and throughout the reception, he couldn't stop praising her choice of profession. "Now that's a real job," he told everyone who would listen. "Rebecca helps people every day, saves lives, makes a difference in her community. You can see the impact of what she does." When someone asked about my work, he gave his usual vague response about government computers and quickly steered the conversation back to Rebecca's latest achievements at the hospital. I finally confronted him that evening, after most of the family had gone home and we were helping clean up the reception hall. Dad, why can't you acknowledge what I actually do for a living? I asked, stacking chairs while he swept confetti from under the tables. I've been working in intelligence for 5 years, and you still talk about my job like it's some kind of hobby or temporary phase. He stopped sweeping and looked at me with genuine confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I was upset about his perfectly reasonable description of my work. Elena, I'm proud of you, he said, leaning on the broom handle. I know you're smart and you work hard, but this spy stuff, it's not something I can relate to. When Rebecca talks about her patients, I understand what she means. When you talk about your job, it sounds like the same fantasy games you used to play as a kid, except now the government is paying you to play them. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how completely he'd failed to understand the trajectory of my life from childhood curiosity to professional expertise. That night, I realized that Dad would never take my career seriously until he could witness its importance in terms he couldn't dismiss or explain away. All my academic achievements, professional recognition, and career advancement meant nothing to him because they happened in a world he couldn't see or touch. I needed something undeniable, a moment when my work would become visible in ways that even he would have to acknowledge as real and significant. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 6 months later, tensions between the United States and China reached a critical point over disputed territories in the South China Sea. Chinese military forces had been conducting increasingly aggressive operations, testing American resolve and threatening to destabilize the entire region. The situation was developing rapidly, with both sides making moves that could lead to armed conflict if misunderstood or mismanaged. Senior officials needed real-time intelligence analysis to navigate the crisis without triggering a war that would devastate global stability. I found myself at the center of the American response, working 18-hour days to provide the analysis that would inform critical decisions about military positioning, diplomatic communications, and economic responses. My understanding of Chinese strategic thinking and military capabilities made me indispensable to policymakers who needed to anticipate Chinese moves and calibrate American responses accordingly. For 2 weeks, I barely left the office, sleeping on a couch in the break room and living on coffee and vending machine food while the fate of international peace hung in the balance. The climax came on a Tuesday afternoon when intelligence sources indicated that China was preparing to announce a major military operation that could trigger American retaliation and spiral into open conflict. The president needed an immediate assessment of Chinese intentions and recommendations for American responses, but the timeline was impossibly tight. The National Security Council was meeting in 2 hours, and they needed my analysis before making decisions that could affect millions of lives. I was the only analyst with sufficient expertise and security clearance to provide the assessment they needed, and there was no time for normal bureaucratic processes. Director Harrison called me directly, bypassing all normal protocols because the situation was too urgent for administrative procedures. Rodriguez, we need your read on the Beijing situation, and we need it now. The president is asking specifically for your assessment because you've been right about Chinese behavior patterns throughout this crisis.
Can you be in the White House Situation Room in 90 minutes? It was the kind of moment every intelligence analyst dreams about and dreads. The moment when your analysis could literally change the course of history. I was rushing around my apartment, grabbing the classified files I'd need for the briefing and trying to mentally organize the key points I'd need to communicate, when I remembered I'd promised to help Dad install a new air conditioning unit at his friend's house that afternoon. In the chaos of the developing crisis, our family commitment had completely slipped my mind. I called him to explain that I couldn't make it, that something urgent had come up at work, expecting him to be annoyed about the last-minute cancellation, but hoping he'd understand. "Elena, you promised you'd help today," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "Carlos is expecting us, and I already told him you'd be there. Can't your boss find someone else to handle whatever computer problem came up?" The phrase, computer problem, made me realize how completely he'd misunderstood the nature and importance of my work, even after 5 years of trying to explain it. Here I was, being personally requested by the President of the United States to provide analysis that could prevent a war. And Dad thought I was troubleshooting software issues? Dad, this isn't a computer problem, I said, checking my watch and calculating how long I had before I needed to leave for the White House. There's an international crisis developing, and I'm the lead analyst responsible for providing intelligence assessments to the president. I literally have to brief the National Security Council in less than 2 hours. I could hear him sigh heavily, the same sound he'd been making since I was 10 years old and explaining my neighborhood surveillance operations. Elena, I'm sure whatever meeting you have is very important to you, he said, his tone suggesting he thought it was anything but important. But you made a commitment to family, and Carlos has been planning this installation around your schedule. Can't you just tell your boss you have a family obligation and go to your meeting tomorrow instead? The suggestion that I could simply reschedule a presidential briefing revealed the enormous gap between his understanding of my work and its actual significance in the real world. I was about to launch into another explanation of why this particular meeting couldn't be postponed when I realized there was a better way to make him understand the importance of what I did for a living. Dad, I'm going to put this call on speaker, I said, setting the phone down on my kitchen counter. I want you to stay on the line and listen to something. I could hear him protesting that he needed to get to Carlos's house, but I'd already committed to this demonstration. 30 seconds later, my secure phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from CIA leadership. I answered it on speaker, making sure Dad could hear every word of the conversation that would follow. Director Harrison's voice filled my kitchen, tense and urgent. Rodriguez, we need your analysis on the Beijing situation. Can you be in Langley by 1800? The weight and urgency in his voice were unmistakable, the tone of someone dealing with genuine crisis rather than routine administrative business. Yes, sir, I replied, checking my watch again. I have the files I'll need, and I can be there in 45 minutes if I leave now. Director Harrison confirmed the details of what he needed and reminded me that the president was specifically asking for my assessment, making it clear that this wasn't a routine briefing, but a critical consultation that could influence major policy decisions. When the call ended, my kitchen fell silent except for the sound of Dad's breathing through the phone speaker. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice completely different from the frustrated tone he'd been using moments earlier. Elena, was that really the director of the CIA calling you personally? I could hear the shock in his voice, the sudden realization that the work he'd been dismissing as elaborate fantasy was real enough to command the attention of the nation's highest intelligence officials. And did he say the president was asking you specifically? Yes, Dad, I said, gathering my files and preparing to rush out the door. This is what I do for a living. This is what I've been doing for 5 years, and it's what I've been preparing to do since I was a kid analyzing neighborhood patterns in our backyard. The only difference is that now the stakes are international rather than local, and the patterns I'm analyzing could affect millions of people instead of just our neighbors. I could hear him trying to process this information, struggling to reconcile his image of his daughter's fantasy job with the reality of Director Harrison's urgent phone call. I don't understand, he said finally. If your work is this important, why didn't you ever explain it properly? Why did you let me think you were just playing around with computers and international news? His tone had shifted from dismissive to genuinely confused, as if he was realizing that he'd fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about my life for the past several years. I paused at my apartment door, keys in hand, and realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for since I was 10 years old. Dad, I've been trying to explain it for 24 years. Every time I showed you my analyses, my academic achievements, my job responsibilities,
You dismiss them as fantasy or temporary phases.
You've been so convinced that my work wasn't real that you couldn't hear what I was actually telling you about it. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us. Years of miscommunication and missed opportunities crystallizing into a single moment of clarity. But this phone call, he said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. This is really happening. You're really about to brief the President of the United States? It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that he was finally ready to accept. The little girl who had set up surveillance operations in the backyard, who had mapped the neighborhood and tracked patterns that seemed meaningless to adults, had grown up to become exactly what she'd always claimed she would become: a professional intelligence analyst whose work mattered at the highest levels of government. "Yes, Dad, it's really happening," I said, my hand on the doorknob. "And I have to go now because they're counting on my analysis to help prevent a war." I started to hang up, but his voice stopped me, urgent and raw with emotion I'd never heard from him before. "Elena, wait!" There was a long pause, filled with years of misunderstanding finally crumbling. "I need to call Carlos and tell him we'll have to install that air conditioner another day. My daughter has to go brief the president." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time in my life, he wasn't just acknowledging my work, he was bragging about it. I drove to Langley with tears streaming down my face, not because I was sad, but because after 24 years of being dismissed as a dreamer living in fantasyland, my father had finally witnessed something he couldn't explain away or minimize. The validation I'd been seeking wasn't just professional recognition. It was the moment when the person who raised me understood that my childhood obsessions had been preparation for something real and significant. The briefing went perfectly. My analysis helped the National Security Council understand Chinese intentions and craft a response that de-escalated the crisis without appearing weak or provocative. The president thanked me personally and asked if I'd be available for follow-up consultations as the situation developed. Walking out of the White House that evening, I felt the satisfaction that comes not just from doing your job well, but from proving that the path you chose was the right one all along. When I got home, there were 17 missed calls from Dad. I called him back, expecting him to want details about the briefing, but instead, he wanted to apologize. "Elena, I've been thinking about everything since you left," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "All those years when you were showing me your projects, trying to explain what you wanted to do with your life, I thought I was being practical. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment by steering you towards something more realistic. But I was wrong about what was realistic." He told me that after my call, he'd spent hours researching what intelligence analysts actually do, reading articles about the CIA and trying to understand the career path I'd been describing to him for years. "I had no idea," he kept saying. "I had no idea that what you were doing was this important, this real. I thought government work meant filing papers and attending meetings, not preventing wars and advising presidents." The conversation we had that night was different from any we'd ever shared before. For the first time, Dad asked detailed questions about my work, my training, and my career goals. He wanted to understand how my childhood fascination with patterns and surveillance had developed into professional expertise, and he listened carefully as I explained the connections between my early spy games and the analytical skills I used every day at Langley. He was genuinely curious about the substance of my work, not just politely tolerating my enthusiasm for something he didn't understand. "I keep thinking about all those maps you made, all those charts and timelines and reports you showed us. You were practicing, weren't you? All those years, you were developing the skills you'd need for this job, and I kept telling you to find something practical instead." The regret in his voice was palpable, and I realized he was grieving not just his misunderstanding of my work, but his failure to support me during the years when encouragement would have meant everything. "Dad, you don't need to apologize," I said, though part of me had been waiting years to hear him acknowledge that my path had been legitimate all along. "You were trying to protect me, and you raised me to be independent and determined. Even when you didn't understand what I was doing, you never tried to stop me from pursuing it. That mattered more than you realize." It was true. Despite his skepticism, he'd never forbidden me from reading intelligence-related books or discouraged me from taking the classes I needed for my career.
He'd questioned my choices, but he'd never sabotaged them. The change in our relationship was immediate and dramatic.
Dad started following international news with genuine interest, calling me to ask about developing situations and how they might affect American interests. He subscribed to foreign policy magazines and began reading articles about intelligence work and national security. When relatives asked about my job, instead of mumbling about government work, he'd launch into detailed explanations of intelligence analysis and its importance to national security. At family gatherings, I became the center of attention rather than the odd relative who worked in some mysterious government office. Cousins who had once rolled their eyes when I discussed international affairs now asked serious questions about global conflicts and geopolitical trends. Uncle Carlos, the same man whose air conditioner installation had been postponed for my presidential briefing, introduced me to his friends as my niece Elena, who works for the CIA and briefs the president. The transformation was so complete that I sometimes wondered if I was dreaming. The most meaningful change was that Dad started sharing stories about my childhood with a completely different perspective. Instead of describing my surveillance operations as weird fantasy games, he told people about my early analytical abilities and natural talent for pattern recognition. She was always special, he'd say, pulling out photos of me at my bedroom desk surrounded by maps and charts. Even as a little girl, she could see things other people missed. I should have realized she was training for something important. 6 months after the South China Sea crisis, I was promoted to senior intelligence analyst and assigned to brief congressional intelligence committees on Chinese cyber warfare capabilities. The promotion came with increased visibility and responsibility, including regular appearances on classified panels and consultation on major policy decisions. When I called home to share the news, Dad's reaction was everything I had ever hoped it would be. "Elena, this is incredible," he said, genuine excitement in his voice. "Senior analyst at your age, and they're asking you to brief Congress? You've accomplished more than I ever imagined possible." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, but more important than his pride was his understanding. He wasn't just happy that I'd been promoted, he comprehended what the promotion meant and why it was significant in the context of my chosen career. That weekend, he drove to Phoenix to buy a frame for the certificate that accompanied my promotion. He hung it in the living room next to Mom's teaching awards and his own recognition from the local Contractors Association, giving it equal prominence with achievements he'd always valued. When neighbors came over, he'd inevitably steer them toward the wall of family accomplishments and spend 20 minutes explaining my career trajectory and recent achievements. The vindication was complete, but it wasn't entirely satisfying. After years of wanting Dad to understand and respect my work, I realized that his approval, while meaningful, wasn't the point. The little girl who had set up surveillance operations in the backyard hadn't been seeking his validation. She'd been following her natural curiosity and developing skills that would eventually serve her country. His recognition was wonderful, but it was secondary to the satisfaction of knowing I'd stayed true to my interests and abilities despite his skepticism. A year later, when tensions with China flared again over Taiwan, I found myself once more at the center of the American intelligence response. This time, however, the call came while I was visiting home for Dad's birthday. We were all gathered in the backyard, the same space where I'd conducted my first surveillance operations 25 years earlier, when my secure phone rang with its distinctive tone. Director Harrison's voice cut through the family chatter. "Rodriguez, we have a developing situation with Beijing. The president wants your assessment within the hour. How quickly can you get to a secure facility?" The question hung in the desert air, and I could see the faces of my relatives processing what they were hearing, the reality of my work becoming undeniably clear in the most ordinary of settings. "I can be at Luke Air Force Base in 30 minutes. I'll need to access my files remotely and coordinate with the analysis team, but I can have preliminary findings to you within 2 hours. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Director Harrison outlining the specific intelligence questions that needed immediate attention and the timeline for briefing senior officials.
When the call ended, the backyard was completely silent. My teenage nieces stared at me with something approaching awe, finally understanding that their aunt's mysterious government job was more significant than they ever imagined. Uncle Carlos shook his head slowly, remembering all the times he'd asked Dad why I couldn't just get a normal job like everyone else. But it's Dad's expression that captured the moment perfectly. A mixture of pride, amazement, and something that looked almost like grief for all the years he'd misunderstood what his daughter was becoming. "Go," he said simply, standing up from his lawn chair. "We'll celebrate my birthday another day. You have work to do." The words were matter of fact, but his voice carried a weight of recognition that had been 25 years in the making. As I gathered my things and headed for the car, I heard him explaining to the family why this call meant I had to leave immediately, his voice filled with authority about intelligence work that he'd spent decades dismissing as fantasy. The drive to Luke Air Force Base gave me time to process what had just happened. For years, I'd imagined the moment when Dad would finally understand the importance of my career, but I'd never envisioned it happening during a family barbecue in the same backyard where I'd conducted my first surveillance operations. There was something poetic about the symmetry, the way my childhood obsessions had come full circle to validation in the exact spot where they'd begun. The crisis briefing went smoothly, my analysis helping to clarify Chinese intentions and recommend policy responses that would maintain stability without escalating tensions. But throughout the intense 3-hour session, part of my mind kept returning to the look on Dad's face when Director Harrison called. It wasn't just surprise or belated recognition. It was the expression of a man realizing he'd fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about his own daughter for most of her adult life. When I returned home late that evening, the family gathering had long since ended, but Dad was still awake, sitting in the living room reading a book about intelligence analysis that he'd apparently bought and started while I was at the base. He looked up when I came in, and for the first time in our relationship, I saw him looking at me not as his little girl who played elaborate games, but as a professional whose expertise was sought by the highest levels of government during international crises. "How did it go?" he asked, setting the book aside. The question was simple, but the way he asked it was different from any conversation we'd ever had about my work. He wasn't humoring me or politely tolerating my enthusiasm for something he didn't understand. He was genuinely interested in the substance of what I'd accomplished and its significance in the broader context of American foreign policy. I explained what I could about the situation without revealing classified details, describing the analytical process and the types of recommendations I'd provided to senior officials. Dad listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that revealed he'd been absorbing more about international affairs than I'd realized during our previous conversations. His questions weren't just polite interest. They demonstrated genuine engagement with the complexities of intelligence work and geopolitical strategy. "I've been thinking about something all evening," he said after we discussed the crisis briefing. "Do you remember when you were about 12 and you came to me with that elaborate report about Mrs. Chen's mysterious Tuesday packages?" I nodded, remembering how he'd dismissed my analysis and told me to stop spying on the neighbors. "You were right, weren't you, about there being something unusual going on?" It turned out that Mrs. Chen had been receiving weekly deliveries of medical supplies because she was caring for her elderly mother-in-law, who had moved in with her family, but whose presence was supposed to remain secret due to immigration complications. My 12-year-old observations had identified a genuine pattern that indicated something significant happening in our neighborhood, even if I'd misunderstood the specific details. Dad had learned this years later through casual conversation with Mrs. Chen, but he'd never connected it back to my childhood analysis until now. "You had the instincts then that you use now," he continued, his voice thoughtful. "I kept thinking you were playing games, but you were developing real skills. You were learning to see patterns and ask the right questions. And I was so focused on what I thought was practical that I completely missed what you were actually doing." The admission was difficult for him, and I could see how much it cost him to acknowledge years of misunderstanding and missed opportunities for encouragement. That conversation marked the beginning of a completely transformed relationship between us. Instead of treating my work as an incomprehensible distraction from real life, Dad became genuinely curious about intelligence analysis and its role in protecting national security. He started reading newspaper articles with a different perspective, looking for the kinds of patterns and connections that might concern professional analysts, and he'd call me to discuss his observations and theories. His enthusiasm was sometimes overwhelming. He'd send me newspaper clippings with handwritten notes about potential intelligence implications, and he'd corner relatives at family gatherings to explain the intricacies of signals analysis and counterintelligence operations. His newfound interest in my career was touching, but it was also slightly embarrassing when he'd launch into detailed discussions of classified intelligence concepts at inappropriate social moments. The real test of his transformed understanding came 6 months later, when I was selected for a special assignment that would take me overseas for an extended period. The mission involved embedded analysis with diplomatic personnel in a sensitive region, providing real-time intelligence support for ongoing negotiations. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward throughout my career. But it also meant leaving the country for potentially several months with limited communication home. When I told Dad about the assignment, his reaction was everything I could have hoped for. Instead of expressing concern about the dangers or questioning whether such work was appropriate for his daughter, he immediately understood the significance of being chosen for such a responsibility. "They're sending you because you're the best person for the job," he said with unmistakable pride. "This is what you've been training for your entire life." His support meant more than any professional recognition I'd received because it represented complete acceptance of the path I'd chosen despite his years of skepticism. He didn't try to talk me out of the assignment or suggest that I should consider something safer and more conventional. Instead, he helped me prepare, asking thoughtful questions about what I'd need and offering practical support for managing my apartment and personal affairs while I was away. The night before my departure, we sat in the same backyard where my intelligence career had begun with childhood surveillance games, talking about how far we'd both traveled from those early days of misunderstanding and dismissal. Dad had brought out photo albums, and we looked through pictures of me at various ages, surrounded by the maps and charts and analytical projects that once seemed like elaborate fantasies, but now appeared as documentation of a developing professional expertise. "I wish I could go back and handle things differently," he said, studying a photograph of 10-year-old me presenting my neighborhood intelligence network to the family.
I wish I'd encouraged you instead of trying to steer you towards something I thought was more realistic. You knew what you wanted to do with your life before you were old enough to tie your shoes, and I spent years trying to convince you it wasn't possible. I understood his regret, but I also recognized that his skepticism had inadvertently strengthened my resolve and forced me to develop the independence and determination that served me well in my career. His doubt had been frustrating, but it had also taught me to rely on my own judgment and pursue my goals regardless of external validation. In some ways, his resistance had been as formative as his support might have been. The overseas assignment exceeded all my expectations and established my reputation as one of the agency's most effective field analysts. My work contributed to successful diplomatic negotiations that resolved several long-standing regional conflicts, and my reporting provided insights that significantly enhanced American understanding of complex political dynamics in a strategically important area. When I returned home after 4 months abroad, I found Dad had been following the news from my region obsessively, trying to identify signs of the diplomatic progress he knew I was supporting behind the scenes. His transformation from skeptic parent to proud supporter was so complete that it sometimes felt surreal. The man who had once dismissed my career as elaborate fantasy now kept a scrapbook of news articles related to my areas of expertise, and he'd marked passages that he thought might be relevant to my work. He subscribed to foreign policy journals and attended public lectures about international relations, building his own understanding of the field he'd once considered impractical and unrealistic. The most meaningful change was in how he talked about my childhood. Instead of describing my early surveillance operations as weird obsessions that he'd hoped I would outgrow, he now told people about my precocious analytical abilities and natural talent for observation.
He'd show visitors the same photographs that had once embarrassed him, now explaining them as evidence of exceptional intellectual development and early professional preparation. His pride in my career became a source of both warmth and occasional embarrassment. At family gatherings, he'd inevitably steer conversations toward my recent assignments and achievements, describing my work in terms that sometimes exaggerated its significance or revealed more than I was comfortable sharing. His enthusiasm was genuine and touching, but it also reflected his desire to make up for years of misunderstanding by overcompensating with excessive praise and promotion. The relationship we developed during this period was deeper and more honest than anything we'd shared during my childhood and early career. Dad began asking me serious questions about global affairs and American foreign policy, treating me as a genuine expert whose insights were valuable and worthy of respect. Our conversations became substantive exchanges about complex geopolitical issues rather than polite updates about work that he didn't really understand or value. His newfound respect for my expertise extended beyond our personal relationship into his interactions with other people. When neighbors or friends expressed opinions about international events, he'd cite my analyses and perspectives as authoritative sources. My daughter Elena works for the CIA, became his standard introduction to discussions about foreign policy, and he'd use my credentials to settle debates and support his own arguments about global affairs. This period of our relationship was characterized by a kind of intellectual intimacy that we'd never experienced before. Dad would call me with questions about news developments, seeking my professional perspective on events that confused or concerned him. He'd read articles about intelligence work and foreign policy, then called to discuss what he'd learned and test his understanding against my expertise. These conversations satisfied something in both of us that had been missing for years. The validation I'd been seeking wasn't just professional recognition from colleagues and supervisors. It was acknowledgement from the person who had raised me that my childhood obsessions had been legitimate preparation for meaningful adult work. Dad's transformation from skeptic to supporter fulfilled a need I hadn't fully realized I carried, the desire to be understood and respected by the person whose opinion had always mattered most to me. His support became particularly meaningful when I faced challenges and setbacks in my career. Intelligence work involves inevitable frustrations and disappointments, moments when analyses prove incorrect or when political considerations override analytical recommendations. During these difficult periods, Dad's unwavering confidence in my abilities and importance of my work provided emotional support that sustained me through professional obstacles. When budget cuts threatened to reduce the size of my analytical team, Dad was more indignant about the potential impact on national security than I was about the professional implications for my career. He wrote letters to our congressional representatives arguing for increased intelligence funding, citing my work as an example of the critical capabilities that would be lost through penny-wise cuts to essential programs. His advocacy was touching and slightly overwhelming, but it demonstrated how completely he'd embraced my career and its significance. The contrast between his early dismissal and his later championing of my work was so dramatic that family members sometimes commented on his transformation. "Remember when Dad used to complain about Elena's spy games?" my cousin would ask during family gatherings. "Now he talks about intelligence analysis like it's the most important job in the world." The observation was accurate, and it reflected how profoundly his understanding had changed once he witnessed undeniable evidence of my work's importance. His evolution from skeptic to supporter wasn't just about my career, it was about his own growth and learning. Dad had spent his working life in practical, tangible professions where results were immediately visible and easily understood. Learning to appreciate the complexity and importance of intelligence work required him to expand his definition of valuable contribution and meaningful achievement. His journey paralleled my own professional development in some ways, both of us discovering capabilities and perspectives we hadn't fully recognized before. The period following my overseas assignment marked the height of our mutual understanding and respect. Dad had moved beyond simple pride in my accomplishments to genuine comprehension of my work's complexity and significance. He understood not just that I was successful, but why my particular skills and expertise were valuable to American national security.
This deeper understanding made our relationship more satisfying for both of us than it had ever been during my childhood or early career.
However, this newfound harmony also created new pressures and expectations. Dad's complete embrace of my career success meant that he now had very high expectations for my continued advancement and achievement. He followed my professional progress with intense interest, and he was sometimes more disappointed than I was when opportunities didn't materialize or when assignments didn't lead to the recognition he thought I deserved. His investment in my career success occasionally felt overwhelming, as if he were trying to make up for years of skepticism by becoming my most enthusiastic promoter and advocate. While his support was welcome and meaningful, it also created pressure to live up to his elevated expectations and to justify his transformed opinion of my work's importance. The little girl who had wanted his approval was sometimes uncomfortable with the intensity of his belated recognition. Despite these minor complications, the transformation in our relationship was largely positive and deeply satisfying. After decades of feeling misunderstood and undervalued by the person whose opinion mattered most to me, I finally had the recognition and respect I'd been seeking since childhood. Dad's journey from dismissive skeptic to proud advocate represented a kind of personal vindication that complemented my professional achievements and made them feel more complete. The skills I developed as a child, analyzing neighborhood patterns and tracking suspicious activities, had evolved into professional capabilities that contributed to American national security at the highest levels. The little girl who had mapped local surveillance networks had grown into an analyst whose work informed presidential decisions and congressional briefings. Dad's recognition of this progression validated not just my current success, but the entire trajectory that had led from backyard spy games to CIA briefing rooms. Looking back on this period, I realized that Dad's initial skepticism had been rooted in love and concern rather than dismissiveness or lack of respect. He had worried that my childhood obsessions would lead to disappointment and failure, and his attempts to steer me toward more conventional careers had been motivated by a desire to protect me from what he saw as unrealistic expectations. His transformation reflected not just a changed understanding of my work, but recognition that his protective instincts had been unnecessary because I'd been capable of achieving exactly what I had always claimed I wanted to do. The validation was complete, but it also marked the end of a particular kind of motivation that had driven me throughout my childhood and early career. The need to prove Dad wrong about my capabilities and the importance of my chosen path had provided energy and determination during difficult periods of education and professional development. Once that validation was achieved, I had to find new sources of motivation and satisfaction in my work that didn't depend on external recognition or approval. The little girl who had conducted surveillance operations in our backyard had finally achieved everything she dreamed about: professional success, meaningful contribution to national security, and recognition from the person whose opinion had always mattered most. Dad's transformation from skeptic to advocate represented the ultimate vindication of a path chosen in childhood and pursued despite years of doubt and discouragement. The imaginary missions had become real, and the person who had mocked them now celebrated them as evidence of exceptional capability and foresight. The phone call that would cement everything came on a Tuesday morning while Dad was visiting my apartment in Washington. He'd flown out to see me receive the intelligence community's highest civilian honor, an award recognizing my contributions to preventing armed conflict between major world powers. We were having coffee in my kitchen, the same space where Director Harrison's calls had once shocked him into silence, when my secure line rang with unprecedented urgency. This time, it wasn't Director Harrison. It was the National Security Advisor herself, calling at 6 in the morning because satellite intelligence had detected preparations for what appeared to be an imminent nuclear test by a hostile nation. The situation required immediate analysis from someone with my specific regional expertise, and there wasn't time for normal protocols or chain of command procedures. "Rodriguez,
"We have a potential nuclear event developing," she said, her voice carrying the weight of global implications. "The president needs your assessment in the Oval Office within 2 hours. This is classified at the highest levels, and you're the only analyst with sufficient clearance and expertise to brief him directly." Dad sat frozen with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, finally hearing the full scope of responsibilities that came with the career he'd once dismissed as fantasy. I was already moving toward my secure files, but I paused to look at Dad's face. The expression I saw there wasn't surprise anymore, or belated recognition, or even pride. It was something deeper, a kind of awe mixed with what looked almost like fear. He was finally understanding not just that my work was important, but that the little girl who had played spy games in his backyard had grown into someone whose analysis could influence decisions about war and peace between nuclear powers. "Elena," he said quietly, after I'd confirmed the briefing details and hung up, "you're really going to advise the president about nuclear weapons?" His voice carried a tremor I'd never heard before, the sound of a man grappling with implications too large to fully comprehend. The daughter he'd raised was about to walk into the Oval Office and provide analysis that could affect millions of lives around the world. I nodded, gathering classified materials and preparing for what would likely be the most consequential briefing of my career. "Dad, this is what I've been building toward my entire professional life. Everything from those childhood surveillance operations to my graduate studies to every assignment I've completed has been preparation for moments exactly like this one." He stood up slowly, setting down his coffee cup with hands that shook slightly. "I need to call your mother," he said, reaching for his phone. "I need to tell her that our daughter is about to brief the president about nuclear weapons." The words sounded surreal even as he spoke them, but they represented the complete transformation of his understanding from the man who had once mocked my imaginary missions. The briefing itself was classified at levels that meant I couldn't share details even with family members, but its successful outcome was eventually reported in carefully worded press releases about diplomatic progress and reduced tensions in the affected region. My analysis had helped the president understand the true nature of the situation and craft responses that de-escalated potential conflict without compromising American interests or allies. When I returned home that evening, Dad was still awake, sitting in my living room reading every news article he could find about the diplomatic developments.
He looked up when I came in, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The weight of what had transpired during the day hung between us, too significant for ordinary conversation or casual debriefing. "The news says there was a breakthrough in negotiations," he said finally, his voice careful and respectful. "They're saying tensions have been reduced and the situation is stabilizing." He didn't ask for details he knew I couldn't provide, but his tone carried understanding that my work had contributed to whatever diplomatic success was being reported. I nodded, exhausted, but satisfied with the day's outcome. "It was a team effort involving many people and agencies," I said, adhering to protocols about discussing classified operations. "But yes, the situation appears to be moving in a positive direction." Dad accepted this limited explanation without pressing for more, demonstrating how much he'd learned about the constraints and responsibilities that came with my security clearance. That night, we sat together in my apartment talking about the journey that had led from childhood spy games to Oval Office briefings. Dad apologized again for the years he'd spent dismissing my career aspirations, but this time his regret carried a different quality. He wasn't just sorry for misunderstanding my work, he was awed by the realization that his daughter had achieved something extraordinary that most people could never imagine experiencing. "When you were little," he said, looking at a photograph from my childhood that I kept on the mantel, "I thought you were just a kid with an overactive imagination. I had no idea you were developing skills that would someday help prevent wars." The admission carried both pride and humility, acknowledgement of how completely he'd misjudged the trajectory of my interests and abilities. The validation was complete in ways I'd never anticipated. Dad's transformation from skeptic to supporter had evolved into something approaching reverence for work he finally understood was genuinely consequential. The little girl who had conducted neighborhood surveillance operations had become a national security professional whose expertise was sought during international crises of the highest magnitude. His newfound understanding extended beyond our personal relationship into his interactions with everyone in his life. When people asked about his daughter's work, he no longer gave vague responses about government employment. Instead, he'd explain with obvious pride that I was a senior intelligence analyst whose assessments informed presidential decisions during international emergencies. The contrast with his earlier dismissive descriptions was so stark that longtime friends sometimes commented on the change. The phone calls from CIA leadership no longer shocked him. They filled him with pride and satisfaction that his daughter had achieved exactly what she'd always claimed she would accomplish. When Director Harrison called during family gatherings or social occasions, Dad would quietly ensure everyone understood they were witnessing something extraordinary, that his daughter's expertise was being sought by the highest levels of American government. The journey from mockery to respect was complete, but it had taken nearly 30 years and undeniable evidence of professional success at the highest possible levels. The childhood surveillance operations he'd once dismissed as fantasy had evolved into analytical capabilities that contributed to preventing armed conflicts and nuclear crises. The imaginary missions had become real responsibilities that affected global stability and international peace. Standing in my apartment that evening, watching Dad read news articles about diplomatic developments he knew I'd helped achieve, I realized that the validation I'd been seeking my entire life was finally complete. The person who had raised me, who had mocked my childhood obsessions and dismissed my career aspirations, now understood not just that I'd been right about my capabilities, but that I'd achieved something genuinely extraordinary that most people could never imagine experiencing. The little girl who had mapped neighborhood activities and tracked suspicious patterns had grown into an analyst whose work informed presidential decisions during nuclear crises. Dad's recognition of this transformation represented the ultimate vindication of a path chosen in childhood and pursued despite decades of skepticism and doubt. The imaginary missions had become real, and the person who had mocked them now celebrated them as evidence of exceptional foresight and determination. His transformation was complete, and so was mine. I no longer needed his approval or recognition to validate my career choices, but having finally achieved both felt like the satisfying conclusion to a story that had begun 30 years earlier in our backyard. The skills I developed as a child had evolved into professional capabilities that served my country at the highest levels, and the person whose opinion had always mattered most to me finally understood and celebrated that achievement.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.